Okay, well, now for the crunchy stuff. This panel is looking at the British politics of Europe's role in employment and social law, and this can be quite a vibrant and sometimes heated debate. And I think we've obviously got three sort of different perspectives here on this difficult issue here today. As warned earlier, this is a fire alarm test and very brief. Excellent. So that was we're all compliant and we can move on. As I was about to say, on my right here is Emma Reynolds, who is Labour's new, reasonably new, Shadow Europe Minister, who took on the role in October 2011 after previously serving on other roles within the Shadow Foreign Affairs team. There was a rapid rise since your entry into Parliament in the May 2010 election, before which you worked supporting British companies in understanding and influencing EU laws, and previously served as Special Advisor to Jeff Hoon when he was Europe Minister. On my left is Billy Hayes, who is the General Secretary of the Communication Workers Union, and something you've been in post since 2001, so over a decade leading the CWU. And you're also the Europe spokesman on the TUC's General Council, through which role you sit as a member of the ETUC Executive and on the board of the Global Union Federation, UNI. And on my further left, although probably not politically, is Persson, who is the Director of Open Europe, and a role you've held since 2010. And you've obviously been at Open Europe for a number of years prior to that, and before that you were working in political consulting in Washington, DC, and Mats is also a contributor to our publication. Would like to start with Emma to kick us off, and we'll go from there. Thank you very much, Emma.
Okay. Well, thank you to the Foreign Policy Centre, the TUC and the European Commission for the timely publication of their report, which I read on the train on my way down from Wolverhampton, and also for enticing me to London on a Friday. I'm still feeling guilt pang, so I'd be grateful if none of you contacted my local paper to say that I was here. But more seriously, the question we're considering today is the British politics of the UK's involvement in employment and social policy. I would say that the prominence of employment and social policy coming from Europe has been pivotal to the way the two major political parties view Europe. And I wanted to refer in opening to two speeches that I think were the turning point for British politics when it comes to the European Union, and they're both in the same year. I'm sure some of you could already guess. The first is Jacques Delors' speech to the TUC in 1988, when he argued that there could be a powerful social dimension to what was up until then considered by many on the left as a kind of capitalist conspiracy, a common market, something that was only based on promoting free trade, something that they viewed with suspicion. I wasn't there at the time, but I'm told they were bowled over by the power of the Commission President, Jacques Delors' argument, and started to see Europe as a force for good in the field of employment and social policy, especially during a very long period of Conservative government. And the other key speech was the Margaret Thatcher speech in Bruges in the same year, in which she criticised other European Union leaders for wanting to integrate too closely. I do remind people, 2 years after she signed up to the Single European Act, which was arguably the largest transfer of power from the UK to Brussels, giving up a veto in the single market. I think she was right to do that, but interesting that 2 years later she sort of tried to disavow that sort of direction of travel. And it's also interesting, she came on a political journey, but so did some of the politicians on the left. The young firebrand socialist Welshman Neil Kinnock, who voted no to the common market in 1975, 25 years later, vice president of the European Commission. Margaret Beckett, also in 1975, voting no to the then common market. 30 years later, as Foreign Secretary negotiating the Lisbon Treaty. So the left has been on a journey which has ended up with most of us, the vast majority of Labour MPs, as pro-Europeans. And the right has gone in the absolute reverse direction. And so if you're a newly elected Labour MP in this Parliament, you are very likely to be, like me, pragmatically pro-European. If you're a newly elected Tory Member of Parliament, you're very likely to be anti-European. And that was seen in October of last year when over half of David Cameron's backbenchers defied his whip and voted for a referendum on the European Union. I'm not saying this is the Employment and Social Affairs is the only reason that there is anti-Europeanism in the Conservative Party. There are other reasons too, but I do think it is one of the key reasons for their opposition to the European Union. And I'll come on a little bit to this question of repatriation right now. So where are the Labour Party now? So I know that although in 1997 we signed up to the social chapter, and that was something that we said that we would do when we won power, I know that there weren't always agreements between the Labour Party and the trade unions during our period in office on employment legislation coming from Europe and other issues, let's say, and we might want to get into the detail of that in the discussion. But where are we now? We are certainly opposed to the repatriation of European social policy. I've read Matt's report and I actually think it's very thorough and well-reasoned. I don't agree with much of it, but it was actually more balanced than I thought when I saw the press release, because the report that Open Europe did in the autumn talked about the cost of European social policy. The headlines were all about this 8.6 billion, I think it was, pounds per year of European social policy. But within the report, they do say that some of these things might be introduced at a national level anyway, and try to estimate what a cost that would be. Now, I think the domestic argument about this is very similar to what we're talking about now. The former Labour councillor Vince Cable, I listened to a Today interview recently when he was trying to defend the government's decision to look at making it easier to dismiss workers. And this is sort of the underlying assumption is if you deregulate, if you make it easier to sack people or make it easier not to have employment protection, somehow this creates jobs. Now, I don't agree with that. I don't think by deregulating that you either increase productivity or suddenly lead to somehow marvelously the production of many jobs. I think actually regulation, if you get it right, can increase productivity and produce healthier workforces in which people work together better. So we're opposed to the repatriation of EU social policy, and we also think, even if it were desirable, which it isn't, it's really quite unrealistic, and especially now. And Philip Souter asked the question to the Commissioner, who was, as Philip thought he was going to be, very diplomatic. I think what David Cameron did in December was pretty staggering, and I refuse to call it a veto. I call it a walkout, because David Cameron decided that he would walk out of a negotiation. There wasn't even a treaty text on the table, and even if there were a treaty text on the table, the weird thing is he is in favour of a fiscal straitjacket, which seems strange. Then he doesn't want to sign up to it. And he produced a list of demands about the city, despite the fact that the domestic rhetoric seems to be that he's in favour of rebalancing the economy. There was nothing in those lists of demands, as I understand it, about manufacturing or other parts of the economy. And it seems to me that it was a purely political decision to keep his backbenchers happy. But interestingly, last week we sat through a session in which even his backbenchers now are saying, what did you manage to stop? Because we have a treaty signed up by 25 member states with the involvement of the European Commission, with the involvement of the European Parliament, with the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. Wow, it seems like it's pretty similar to a European Union treaty to me. The only difference is we have 2 member states, us and the Czech Republic, who haven't signed it. I don't know what he was thinking, because in Matt's report he talks about, in the Open Europe report, and rightly so, they talk about the risk of caucusing, the risk of the 17 Eurozone member states coming together more often and making decisions on issues that are beyond the remit of the Eurozone, on the single market and other issues. I think the risk of caucusing was dramatically increased by what David Cameron did in December, and this could include the areas that are under discussion today. And in conclusion, on a totally different issue, but I think this is relevant, I would like to congratulate the trade unions for what happened at the Lindsey Oil refinery before the last general election, because I think there's a great risk across Europe that populism is on, right-wing populism, extremism is on the increase. And what the trade unions did during that time was made sure that the argument wasn't about whether workers were foreign or domestic, but was about all workers getting equal rights and equal terms and conditions. And if the trade unions hadn't have been so active, I think that would have left a space for the BNP, who were trying to get into those demonstrations. And I would just say to you today that there is this relationship between employment and social affairs and the rights of workers, and us fighting for that, and if making sure that there isn't a vacuum in which the BNP and other equivalent parties across Europe can step into. So I congratulate the trade union movement on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma. Billy.
Thanks for the opportunity to address you today. A long time ago now, I travelled Europe as a young man in what was known as, in them days, doing a Jack Kerouac, for those who know the book, On the Road, many years ago. I lived some time in Greece, about a month in Greece and about 2 months in Germany, and I learned, Entschuldigen Sie bitte, haben Sie Arbeit bitte? For those who know your German, that means, excuse me, have you got a job? Because at that time, in Germany certainly, when I lived in Munich and Frankfurt, you know, it was a revelation, you know, with a father who'd fought in the war, that what was happening in Germany, just in terms of, you know, the German experience in particular, but just what the feel for Europe. And I think Europe, the issue of Europe can be reduced to 2 things, really: the absence of war and a degree of social harmony, particularly in terms of race. Because what you know, within certainly our parents' lifetime, you know, what was Europe like before the early stages in the 1950s, and what became the common market in 74. And unlike, you know, so you say about Emma's point about going from the left on a journey, strange as it may seem, in 75 I was one of the few people, if you like, then in the Labour Party, who voted yes to stay in on the renegotiation of the... and I've never, for all the problems in Europe, I've never thought I made a mistake then. And more recently, I was one of the people, together with Brendan, that negotiated with the government on the Agency Workers Directive. And as a General Secretary, you know, obviously I'm in the CDW representing telecoms workers and postal workers. You know, our interests are from Abergavenny to Athens, from Finland to Faro. So it's obviously, you know, certainly in terms of when we talk about Europe, but what we're looking at in Europe at the moment is obviously want to talk about inequality, the inequality on all sorts of levels, and I really haven't got time to go into the whole question of single currency and the fiscal union that's looming. But Europe's essentially a debate about inequality between deficit countries and surplus countries. but it's not so much about public sector deficits as trade deficits. If you look at the countries in deepest trouble now, these weren't the countries with the greatest debt or budget deficit in the past decade. They were the countries with the greatest current account deficits. And basically, they were importing themselves into a crisis fueled by low interest. We've got income inequality and private debt. But what is worse, deeper inequality or inequality of incomes? And for too long, the people of Europe have been getting by on what we used to call getting by on tick. So instead of low wages and easy credit, we need sustainable levels of demand higher than they are now. And there's a crisis of growth, there's a crisis of investment in Europe, and we need less. I don't know when it's going to happen, when someone's going to recognise, when they look at Ireland or they look at Greece, another round of cuts. Because it feels to me like the latest crisis in Greece, there's going to be another crisis in 6 months where they come out of the euro or whatever, where it be another round of cuts. And it's certainly what's happening at the moment is not working. Inequality is bad for Europe's economy, and it's bad for Europe as a whole. And as already been made mention, social tensions are rising. The moment the cameras are focusing on the Greek trade unionists and Spanish youth and protesting about what governments are doing, but things are still worse. As the economy struggles, the European right will find a new voice, and I think that's, you can see very early, whether it's what's happening in Switzerland. No, it's not in the European Union, but the banning of minarets, or even what's happening in France. I think there's a real danger of the rise of racism across Europe. Government and bond traders who advocate austerity need to be careful what they wish for in terms of the 30s. In terms of labour law, it obviously doesn't have to be that way. We need to build stronger European institutions. Labour law is one of those institutions. When we met Cameron before, seems like a long time ago now, but when we met David Cameron as a TUC, I said to Cameron, it could only be in Europe where the Prime Minister meeting trade unions was a news story. Because Angela Merkel regularly meets trade unions. In fact, the CDU, there's groups of CDU. I know the CDU is not an exact replica of the British Tory party. I mean, you'd go hard to find anything like the British Tory party in Europe. It always feels to me as it's two parties in one. Some Social Democrats, a bit of Kenneth Clarke, but essentially, as Emma said, a gang of anti-Euro fanatics, it seems like at times. But you look across Europe, so that's the kind of level we're coming at it. We need to talk about expansion, high pay, skills. Polly Toynbee's article today in The Guardian, for those of you who may have read it. I thought the most significant, and I'll finish on this point, in the debate for trade unionists, and there's as we all know, there's a anti-European left. And Alex squares with internationalism, but believe that for one side at the moment. The No to EU campaign got 0.5% in the polls at the last election. Not the what they call UKIP. Thank you. Forgot the name. UKIP picked up a lot more, but there's an anti-European left. But I thought what was most significant on the Commons vote when the Cameron had that backbench revolt. On Newsnight that very night, the government minister responsible was talking about repatriation. He didn't talk about common agriculture policy or whatever. The first thing he honed in on was labour law. That's what we want to see repatriated. And also not forgetting Cameron's attempt, albeit forlorn, to try and unpick the European Agency to Workers Directive. So for trade unionists coming at this, not saying that there's not problems with European institutions, not saying there's not problems with fiscal unity, because essentially what we've done, or what's happened in Europe, is this. The USA didn't have a single currency until 60 years after its creation. It's a little known fact, because all the states had different currencies. We've created a single currency, but we haven't got a single fiscal policy. I'm not advocating one here now, but I think that's kind of the tensions at the heart of Europe, and also the democratic deficit. I haven't got time to talk on here today, but essentially for trade unions, you know, we value the European institutions. We want to see them strengthened, particularly in terms of labour law and social policy. So that's our perspective and where we're coming from. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Billy. Matt, what's your take on these issues?
Thank you very much, and thanks so much for the invitation, and thanks to the Foreign Policy Centre, the European Commission, and TUC. I also think this is a very timely event, and it's an issue that to some extent is being under-discussed, at least the substance of it. There's a lot of emotions flying around, but the substance is rarely actually properly dealt with. Just, I suppose, two questions here. First of all, should employment law be at the EU level? There's a lot of talk about repatriation. So let's have a look at the principles behind having employment law at the EU level in the first place. And the second question I want to ask is this talk about repatriation politically realistic, and where does it stand in Britain in terms of domestic politics? So on the first point then, I mean, the principle behind EU law at the employment law at the EU level, does it stand up? And I think traditionally you've had 5 arguments in favor of EU level employment law versus 5 arguments against, and I'm sure you have your own arguments that you want to put up as well. But I would say there are the 5 arguments in favor of EU level employment law would be that from a business point of view, it can reduce compliance cost. It can reduce compliance cost by replacing 27 sets of regulations with one. From a business point of view, it can also remove uncertainty involved in doing business across borders. The third thing I will say, which sort of is a more general argument, which is all usually employed by unions and others who take this point of view, is that it can promote fair competition and in particular counter what some people refer to as social dumping. In the UK, that has often been perceived as mean that there are employment laws in place that would not have been there had it merely been subject to a domestic political debate. That's the third argument in favor. The fourth argument, which is a quite interesting one, is that people who tend not to agree necessarily that this is the best of all outcomes to have these kind of social laws at the EU level, for example, the Working Time Directive, say, well, you know, there's something we have to accept as a sort of price, a side payment, to have access to all the benefits that comes with European Union membership, including, most importantly, the single market. That's the fourth argument. The fifth argument that people put forth in favor is that, and particularly now, is that it's not ideal, perhaps, but we don't want to engage in a massive political fight with our European partners. This is not the time nor the place to do that. So to avoid a political row and trying to sort of unpick the treaties, that's a fifth argument. To counter those 5 arguments, there are sort of arguments that people put forth that are sort of the ones against having the EU heavily involved in EU employment law. And those are the following. First, you have a one-size-fits-all approach to regulation can impose disproportionate costs. It's very difficult to regulate for 27 different member states and do that in a way that is tailored around these specific member states' economic circumstances and labour market models. The second one, which is actually related to the first, is that, which I think is the most important one, arguably, is that it undermines national democratic settlements. So in other words, you have certain labour market models that involve social partners that have evolved over decades as a result of democratic discourses. The fifth argument is that it's very difficult to change, which some people put forth, that if you have a law established at the EU level, then it's very difficult to go back and revise it, even if it's not the best law in light of evidence and changing economic circumstances. And number 4 is that EU laws can take a life of their own, in particular at the hands of the European Court of Justice. We've seen that with the Working Time Directive, for example, the impact on junior doctors. And the final argument is that precisely that the ECJ can interpret laws in unpredictable ways. So you sort of have those, I think, 5 quite interesting arguments against and in favor. So my question then is, have you engaged in those arguments properly when you put forth the various arguments for and against EU-level involvement or EU-level employment law. And I think that's the first thing we need to ask. Let's not do this sort of on basis of lazy ideology or based on sort of emotionalism or party politics. Let's think about this carefully. Do these arguments stand up in favor and against EU-level employment law? So I want to challenge everyone here to just think about that. And we put forth in our report that discussion, which I thought was very interesting, because on both sides, on all sides of this argument, very rarely do you actually dig into the substance of the pros and the cons of the current arrangement. Now, I would say this. From the left's point of view, I think these arguments, the balance of these arguments have changed. And the reason why I'm saying that is because over recent years, you have moved away from the concept of a social Europe, which involved the EU regulating up, the EU being seen as a way to lock in a certain basic minimal level of social protection. That was the basic assumption underpinning social Europe in the 1990s. And as Emma mentioned, that Jacques Delors speech, which was very much setting out a vision for social Europe. That was the case before. In recent years, quite clearly, social Europe has lost momentum. What we're now seeing is, in one sense, the very opposite. Instead of a minimum wage in Europe, we now see Commission-led, EU-led, ECB-led, and IMF-led drive to lower minimum wages in places like Greece. And we're talking a quite radical lower minimum wage in Greece. We're not talking a small share of the minimum wage going down. We're talking quite substantial lower minimum wage. So my question is, here you basically have it. Where the Eurozone crisis has allowed EU wage-setting competences via the back door, something which the left pushed for quite some time, is that a good or bad thing? Are you intellectually against or in favor of EU-level involvement in wage-setting? So that's the first thing. Quite clearly, the EU-led austerity drives around Europe has changed the dynamics of these arguments around social Europe. So are you in favor or are you against EU involvement in EU competences? The second thing I would point out, which Emma alluded to, is this idea of, or this row over the Postal Workers Directive and postal workers and the free movement of workers. What happened there, I think, very much took unions off guard, when the ECJ basically ruled sort of in favor of employers in cases in Sweden and elsewhere, saying that, yes, unions have the right to strike, but basically free movement takes precedence in that you need to have a clear and transparent way of negotiating your wages. You cannot apply the local going rate over the national rate, for example. That was, in my view, a quite big thing for the unions. The Laval case, the Rufel case, the Viking case. Now, again, what the ECJ did there was that not only did it sort of rule in this particular case, it also extended its own competence in that it now has the right to define unions' right to strike in certain circumstances. So the challenge for unions and the left is, are you intellectually against or in favor of EU competence in this area, EU involvement in this area? Because you cannot say that, no, the ECJ should not be involved here. All you can say is that you disagree with the ruling, but it was right for the ECJ to rule. If you're consistent, you say, actually, it was not right for the ECJ to rule on this. They should have sent it back to the Swedish courts in this case, because this is not an EU-level competency. I mean, that intellectual tension, I've never heard anyone speak about how you're actually supposed to solve that if you're in favor of EU-level competence in this area. So I will put that to you, that those arguments that I mentioned before, I think the balance of them have changed. Finally, the domestic politics of EU employment law in the UK. Well, it's quite interesting because it's funny because I saw this was sort of the British perspective on EU employment law, and I must admit I'm not British. I don't know if you heard it on my slightly goofy Swedish accent, but I'm not from these parts of the world. I'm from a part of the world where we managed to combine very strong protection of workers and strong union presence with, last year, a growth rate of 4.6%. Sweden. I mean, I know and I appreciate and I respect very much the need to have basic workers' protection, the need for unions and employers to have an ongoing dialogue. I mean, of course we should have that. That's a given. We need to have basic protection rights. That is not the same as saying that the EU should be involved in them. Those are two separate arguments. So when I hear this thing about anti-European, pro-European, I think that's lazy. That's lazy talk. We need to have a much more mature and grown-up discussion about where the division of labour should be between the EU and member states. It had nothing to do with being anti-this or anti-that. It's just about a practical, pragmatic discussion about where things should be decided, which level are the best decided. And I think that's what we need to be. In terms of the practicality of it in Britain, I agree, certainly. It has not been always the most informed debate from the Conservative side either. And I think realistically it's very difficult for the UK government to achieve proper repatriation of EU employment law, because that involves, again, starts to mess with the EU treaties in a quite fundamental way. But that's not the same to say as principally this is something that should be regulated at the EU level in the first place. Those are two separate discussions. And again, I would encourage everyone to really engage with arguments rather than fall victim of this temptation to engage in party political debates. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt. I'm just going to very briefly chip in a few things that came out of actually the work that Owen and I did for this pamphlet on repatriation. And I think, from my perspective, certainly the argument about the principle of whether the EU should have an involvement, not necessarily a discussion about the extent of the involvement, it follows fairly straightforwardly like this. If there are a basic floor framework of rules for the capital within the single market, for goods within the single market, for services within the single market, therefore there needs to be a floor set of rules for labour. And it is internally consistent. And I think there is no particular reason as to why EU engagement in labour regulation undermines national settlements any more dramatically than it does EU engagement in any of these other arguments. Any international agreement, not only at an EU level, involves a derogation of certain democratic rights of parliaments and future parliaments to make different decisions, but they do so in order to get overall goals, and ultimately that is when you get into an in or out discussion rather than a reform discussion about whether you want to take or leave it. But what was interesting as part of the discussions we had running up to this, that the three main business organisations did broadly, although they listed a lot of different concerns as to why they weren't entirely happy with how EU employment law was, they accepted the broad principle that there should be a level playing field within the single market within different bounds. I think the idea of what that level playing field looks like would be very different from what Billy or Owen or anyone else would say. But so I think there is a fundamental argument that needs to be assessed there, that it's a debate about how much rather than whether, certainly from my perspective. And obviously I think we'll get into some of those discussions in the questions, but I just thought I'd throw that in there because that's been something that we've been looking at as part of the book that you can all read over the weekend. Okay, we'll open up to questions from our audience in rounds of 3, please. David Seymour, and gentleman there, and gentleman at the back there. Martin, the gentleman here. And then the gentleman there.
Thanks, David Seymour, ex-political editor of the Mirror Group. Matt says we should have a debate. Well, I couldn't agree more with him about that, if about nothing else. I mean, obviously what we've had from Emma and Billy are two people who really put the case from the left for the EU and for involvement in the EU. But what we don't have is a debate. And I've been watching this long enough to see, first of all, the Labour Party backing off further and further and further. Not that there isn't commitment from Emma and all sorts of people, including current leader and his brother even more so. And the TUC, I mean, I remember being at TUC in the late 90s where there was a sort of for and against debate. And in fact, the people who were against were actually for. They were just saying, not now, but they were helping to make up the numbers for the debate. And there's definitely been a movement within the unions, which I think reflects that terrible movement that there's been in the polling in the population, which now sees something like 30% of people want to get out and 40-something% who want a repatriation of powers when they have absolutely no idea what the consequences would that be, even if it was possible. I just wondered what the panel thought about that and how we could reverse this.
Yes, hello. Tony Burton, I'm an employment lawyer. One thing we never seem to hear a great deal about is an economic defence of social policy, because if you have a cowed and frightened workforce with no security of employment, are they going to be economically active? We're going to have the rearrangement of employment rights to 2 years from April. What building society or bank is going to make finance available to somebody in that situation?
Nicola, at the back.
I'm Nicola Kouduris from UCL Laws, and I was wondering if I could. I found your speech, Mr. Persson, very interesting, but ultimately not very convincing, I have to say. I'm not persuaded that either the 5 arguments in favor of EU-level regulation of social law are persuading, but neither are your 5 counter-arguments. And I was wondering if I could be just as provocative as you have been, whether you think that a European Union with 27 repatriated labour law systems could operate whilst fundamental economic market freedoms are regulated and safeguarded by the ECJ at an EU level. And what will happen to your lovely Swedish social model in that context, in which we have an ECJ that will be fostering free movement of services, and so on and so forth, but we'll have absolutely nothing to say about EU-level labour law.
Thank you. And we'll come back and do a second round of questions in a minute. If we'd like to go in reverse order this time, Max, do you want to kick us off?
Thank you. Public opinion is, I know it's very painful to deal with. It's awful, this thing known as democracy. I mean, at one point, I think you're right in one sense. I wasn't entirely sure what you were asking, if it's that unions and the left need to make a case for strong engagement with the European Union on the social employment front. With the public. Yeah, and I think so too. I think there needs to be a more informed discussion in Britain as in elsewhere around Europe. But at the end of the day, it's not unusual that you have a public who feel intuitively and instinctively that something isn't quite right with the current arrangement and they want to change it, but they don't know exactly what they want to change. I mean, that's the case in a lot of countries on a lot of issues. So I don't think that's that's not specific to the EU issue here. But no, of course, no, there should be more informed debate. But at the end of the day, you cannot sort of artificially impose something on a reluctant public. I mean, at the end of the day, that won't work. We see how that there are a lot of historical cases when that has backfired. So I think we need to have more of an informed debate. Politicians need to be clear about the arguments for and against, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that they should sort of completely ignore public opinion. But I'll take your point. On the economic case, I think that's what I was trying to say, is that, I mean, again, I am from a country which, I mean, I'm repeating myself, which managed to combine a very strong growth rate with very strong social protection. I think part of the reason why Sweden is so successful in economic terms is because there is a lot of certainty on the labor market. It has found a labor market model which works economically and which both the employer side and the union side buy into. And I think that's very important. So I'll make that case for you. And I say my native country. It's not because I think everything is great with Sweden, but because... But I'm saying it now, and I'm in Britain. On the point about for and against, I don't necessarily buy into all the arguments for and against. I was just saying that those were traditionally the arguments. What happened if you actually remove all social protection at the EU level? I don't know, to be honest. I don't know if the EU completely withdraws from social employment law and wage setting. Do you know where the net balance will lie? What will happen now? If you, for example, if you had the Commission withdrawn from Greece and the talks in Greece, you might have stronger protection in Greece, because obviously what happens there is that it's kind of depressing, it's lowering previous levels. I mean, you don't know where the net balance is at. That's why it's so interesting. Oops, I'm getting excited. That's why it's so interesting, this whole thing about where Europe is heading at the moment, is that the arguments are changing. So in that sense, those 5 arguments for and against were not necessarily the ones that I would flag up myself, but I'm saying those are traditionally the ones that people have flagged up. What would happen with the Swedish model? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. If anything, what has happened now with the Laval case is that the ECJ, you have state involvement in an area where previously there was no state involvement. Same thing with the Temporary Agency Workers Directive. You know, whilst a lot of people in Sweden would agree with it, in principle, it messes with that model of voluntary collective bargaining which has been so successful. Why? What's the point? Why do you need that? You don't need that in Sweden. Now, I take your point where in places where you have bad workers' protection, where you, for example, have no limit whatsoever on working hours and no health and safety law, of course, there you need some basic protections, but certainly not in Sweden.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things Sweden is famous for is a high level of trade unionisation. I think the last time I looked, it was about 68%. So maybe having lots more unionised workplaces. In fact, when I was in Sweden, on behalf of the TUC, I went to a trade unionised workplace where everybody was in the union. The management agreed it was a good thing to be in the union. And it was a stud farm. Now, there's a joke there somewhere. I don't know exactly what the joke is. But it was a workplace you wouldn't traditionally associate trade union organisation. So Sweden's got a lot to recommend it. In terms of, I just can't get my head around, to be honest with you, Matt. If you have a single market, why you don't have a level playing field in labour regulation? What level you set it, it's a debatable point. But I don't see how. With liberalisation of postal services across Europe, it will finish in 2013 when the final countries for the total market liberalisation. And I can't get my head around, if I'm a postal worker in the UK, why I don't have some kind of social protection if I'm a postal worker in France or Germany or whatever. In terms of why the European argument per se, I have to say, I'm a little bit nervous about some in the Labour Party, not Emma, I haven't heard Emma's, but I've heard some people starting to pull back a little bit. I don't know whether that's polling or focus groups or whatever. I think the reason why Cameron was popular is because it appeals to the we don't like Johnny Foreigner arguments. I think there's no question about it. It's very easy in Britain, a post-imperial, post-empire world. A lot of British people have a problem coping with that. And in today's times in which we live, I think the case really in the UK, let's be honest, the case really in Europe, we've never really made the argument for Europe in this country. It's always felt, when the arguments are stripped down, people, there's a rational discussion about it. It's very easy, but when you hear Farage on the telly, he's entertaining. It plays well, but it doesn't. Often as not, most of what he says doesn't have any foundation in the world in which most of us live, which is So I think there is a problem. There's no question about that in terms of. So I think it's, I can't see how you can't have some kind of regulation, pan-European, if you've got a single market, and I think there's a case to be made for restating the case for Europe, particularly amongst the trade unions.
Well, the only consolation I take from Matt's analysis is that although I'm a lazy Labour MP, there are also lazy Tory MPs around too. So that's nice to know. That is nice to know. Okay, let me try then to get to be a little less lazy. And I think the even less lazy question is not whether employment law should be at an EU level, but to what extent employment law should it be at an EU level. So let me just tell you about some of the rows we had with the trade unions. The elephant in the room, let it out. In government, the Labour Party didn't think that we should have to totally abide by the Working Time Directive. We negotiated an opt-out, an individual opt-out from the Working Time Directive. So the Labour government at the time was saying, to the extent that the EU wants to put a cap on working time, we think that individuals should have the choice as to whether they agree with that or not. However, the other thing that is perhaps more to the trade unions' liking, or probably not far enough, but is that we didn't think that when you are given your employment contract, you should be given your opt-in, opt-out form at the same time, because that doesn't really seem to be much of a freedom of choice. So that hopefully gets to some slightly less lazy argument. But I also think that if you look at the Posted Workers Directive and some of the disputes that have been ruled on by the ECJ, these are cross-border issues. So how on earth do you expect a single country to deal with some very, very difficult cross-border issues? Trade unionists and others might not like the ECJ rulings, but that's not to say that they are opposed to European employment law. That would be a lazy assumption, I think, and a lazy analysis of the issue. I also think, coming to your point, Mats, about collective bargaining, many European directives which are then transposed at a national level, such as working time, respect collective bargaining and make allowance for collective bargaining, either very often sectorally, and some of the opt-outs of working time are agreed sectorally in different countries. So, you know, it's not either you don't have your collective bargaining because you have an EU level law, or you do. That's again a black and white analysis of the argument. When it comes to David's point, one point on which I do agree with Mats is that we do need a better informed discussion about our membership of the European Union. It is thoroughly frustrating to see how these things are covered in many newspapers, not all newspapers, but many newspapers, even in some of our cherished broadcast media institutions. I won't name names, but I did an interview early one Saturday morning after the Prime Minister's walkout, and I was asked by the person interviewing me, isn't it a good thing that the Prime Minister didn't take us into the Euro? I spent most of the next 3 or 4 minutes telling this woman what this was about and what it wasn't about. And it was, again, pretty frustrating. So, yes, we need a better informed discussion. No, we don't have a greatly well-informed discussion. There is a big problem about this. For many years, we had the argument that the post-war settlement, Europe coming together, in the post-war period, this was a great argument in favour of a union of some sorts, and that came to be defined over the years. That argument doesn't really resonate very much anymore because we're a long way from that, and many generations don't remember the immediate post-war period. Then, for years, when the economy was doing okay in many parts of Europe, we had the sort of prosperity argument for our membership of the European Union, our trade, the jobs, the investment. That has come under threat because of the images on our screens of protests in different countries against cuts in different countries, apparently governments being taken out apparently by other governments. That's a bit simplistic. And the suggestion that at one stage a European institution should run the budget of a country. Now, I think there's some... They don't always do us favours in terms of the suggestions that are coming out of some of the discussions in Brussels. And I do think people are becoming more Eurosceptic. However, I think if we had to have a referendum at some point, I think there's still a chance that we could win it, and we'd have to make that argument. And if you look at any leader of any party who's actually won an election since we joined in 1973, no party leader who's won an election has advocated withdrawal from the European Union. So that tells you something. And it would also mean that business would have to get out there and start arguing for our membership of the European Union, which I think they don't so much, to be honest. And it would, everyone's back would be against the wall. And, the stakes are high. So, I don't know. It's worrying, but I'm up for the fight if we have to have it. The other interesting thing is the polling shows that there's a lot more hostility to the institutions of the European Union, which seem very remote and very far away, and in some cases not very democratic. I don't personally think the European Commission is particularly democratic. It's not really along our lines. You know, if you're a French person, maybe it would be, because your ministers are appointed by your president. Your prime minister is appointed by your president. But in our country, you have to be elected to a parliament. Well, apart from the Lords, where they can just like pick you and put you in there, throw you in there, and put you in a department. That's a slight difference. But the European Parliament's directly elected, and the European Council of Ministers, as you know, the Council of Ministers, is made up of elected ministers from member states. But the polling shows that people are more favourable to the idea that the EU is where you would solve cross-border issues such as cross-border crime, terrorism, environmental problems. People are open to those arguments, to those objectives. I think I've probably spoken for too long, but I like Matt's answer to Tony. I think that we have a lot to learn from the Swedish and Danish model of combining flexibility, particularly the Swedish. In fact, I think the Swedes in our country are greatly influential. Not only Mats, but we've got the girl with the dragon tattoo. We had Wallander. Anyway, we won't go into all that. And just to finish on Nikolai's point, I think that it would be deeply strange that in a union where we have free movement of labour, goods, capital and services, that you just don't have anything to do with labour. You don't have any minimum standards. However, you regulate everything else. You regulate goods, you regulate services, you regulate capital. But hey, don't worry, it doesn't matter about all the people moving around wanting to work in different member states. That would be deeply strange and would create a sort of lopsided arrangement, if that's not too lazy a way of putting it.
No, thank you very much. As far as hands go up, as we haven't got much time left. But okay, can I ask questions to be brief and the answers to them also to be brief? The gentleman there's got the microphone already, but Philip, gentleman there, basically everyone with a hand up will eventually get a microphone, but be very, very brief.
Right, this is particularly for Anne. Emma. If David Cameron had gone ahead, together with the Czechs, and signed up to that treaty, it would have been a European treaty on fiscal union. If he'd done that, he would have to put it to the British public for a referendum. So there was no way he was going to do that, to let us have a referendum now. We may in 2017, when they try and roll it all into the treaties, get to that situation then. But I'd like to ask you, do you think your current leader or your next one in waiting would vote for a fiscal union and then or sign up to a fiscal union and then be prepared to put it to the British public? Because I think you know what the result would be.
Okay. Thank you very much. Philip.
I'd like to disagree with Emma on one point. I think if there was a referendum, we wouldn't have a slight chance of winning it. It would be an absolute decisive victory for people that thought we should remain in the EU. But Matt, I think it's right to look at these various things from a cost-benefit perspective. If you have a single market, you need certain rules about minimum standards in order to provide, a fair level playing field. But not everything works for it. So if we're going to have competition, should we have competition in tax? And if we don't have competition in tax, why shouldn't we have competition in social regulation? And that's potentially the point you make. But I think you have to ask yourself, what is the evil that the single market is trying to combat? And that is probably social dumping. And you probably can't combat social dumping without having some sort of minimum standards on social and employment regulation. And I think that is the principled argument for that, and I think that holds. But just to Emma addressed this point, but I just want to say that you say, well, public opinion and democracy are inconvenient, but they're not the same. If you accept that the UK is basically a functioning democracy, you have to accept the legitimacy of the fact that the current government, while flirting with repatriation, hasn't actually done it, and neither has any previous government in the last 30 years. And that's probably for a sound political reason.
Okay. If people had their hands up initially, there's the gentleman there. The person who's got the microphone can speak. It's like a conch.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
So I'm Alexandra Gonzalez. I'm a student at Birkbeck, also a French person, as you can notice from my accent. And I think there's one point that Emma just raised about the perception of European Union institutions as opposed to European Union-like concrete actions. And I think that's very key to the discussion, I think, specifically on employment and social law. And my question actually goes more to Billy regarding the trade unions. And I would like to know what would be your perception of having a concrete common sort of platform or actions with other European trade unions. And I think in particular of German trade unions and French trade unions. Because it might be sad, but at the end of the day in the EU, decisions are mostly taken by those three countries, UK, France, Germany. How do you think that could be made, and is it likely to happen in the near future? Thank you.
Thank you.
Pedros Vasoulas of the European Movement. I agree with what Matt said, and that doesn't happen very often. What's going on in Greece and the other IMF program countries, Portugal and Ireland, does qualify as a reduction of social protection levels. But I think that's where the agreement finishes. Blaming the European Commission for it displays a misunderstanding of how policy is made. The European Commission is indeed a bureaucracy, and it does what the Eurogroup in this case tells it. And the Eurogroup is predominantly made up of conservative governments who believe in that kind of philosophy. So my question is, do you think, and that's for the whole panel, do you think that once the current economic policy applied across the Eurozone start hurting people, will we see a change towards center-left government? And if that does happen and the balance is restored, will they change the kind of economic policies applied in the Eurozone right now?
Okay. Chris.
Yep. Two brief points, one on employment social law and one on the politics. I suppose at risk of accusing Mats of being lazy, just sort of challenge the assertion or the argument that you gave that there's the one size fits all. We need to be clear, there are 27 different sets of employment law in Europe, but there is one flaw. It's not universal. We may wish we had the same employment and social protections in the UK as they have elsewhere in continental Europe, but we don't. We have 27 different systems, so there is flexibility in there. The second on the politics is that mention has been made of opinion polls and Euroscepticism and sort of increasing, as it seems, anti-European sentiment. But there's never a strong argument put forward in favour of Europe on a consistent basis. And there's two elements that I'd identify. One is that when something bad happens, it's EU bureaucrats doing something. When it's good, it's to the credit of the domestic government. And secondly, whenever we go to a European summit, it's all about battling for Britain. It's about red lines. No wonder the public thinks it's a bad thing.
Excellent, thank you. And you're Chris Weavers from NASWORD, by the way.
Yeah, Neil Nerva. I'd like to thank Billy and Emma for their good defence of the European ideal, which we don't often hear from the centre-left. I almost woke up relieved after the summit, thinking Cameron could have actually said, I've gained hegemony in Europe for austerity, and look what I've done, I've come back and delivered this for the whole of Europe. But I sense he's so worried about Little Britain in the media that it was more important to actually be seen to be going for the red lines than it was actually for his political project of austerity. But the question I've got is the race to the bottom, which is alive and well. We would see social and employment rights within Europe as being a tool to stop the race to the bottom. Is that a debate inside the EU, or is that the EU as compared to other parts of the global economy, where people do not enjoy the type of rights which we do, by and large, wherever we are in Europe, enjoy? And that is.
Okay, excellent. I think we have one final question, if I'm right, at the back there.
Can you can hear me okay?
We can, yes.
Right. I'm Kingswood, Chartered Architect. To Mats, thank you for reminding us that Sweden enjoyed more than 40 years of democratic socialist government. The EU Troika makes laws, then the 27 countries have to implement. They can either, and some implement as guidance, others treat as window dressing. But the conflict is that there's two cultures in Europe, north and south of the Alps, the Mediterranean and Scandinavia. So how is there a way of bringing the two cultures together so that when there is legislation, it's actually not window dressing, but able to be implemented? Thank you.
That's probably all we've got time for now, just on the basis that we need to go and give people time to wind up. So obviously I'd ask, there's no need for panellists to respond to every single question all the time, and if you want to roll in any final remarks you want to make, I will start with Emma.
Okay, I'll try and be quicker this time and not talk about Wallander. To the chap at the back, I didn't catch your name. Let's be clear, the Fiscal Compact Treaty introduces rules for the Eurozone member states. Now, what the government might have tried to argue, what would be, and what they were sort of saying before the Council in December, was if that treaty doesn't involve a transfer of power from here to Brussels, i.e. if it doesn't apply to us, there wouldn't have to be a referendum. However, there were members of his cabinet who were incredibly nervous about that argument. And I think it wasn't so much that he thought he might have to have a referendum, but even before that, he thought that he wouldn't win a vote, or it would at least create a lot of difficulties for him in Parliament, because even if the treaty weren't put to the people, it would have been put to Parliament. So he had 80 of his backbenchers defying the whip in October. If he'd have had to come to Parliament early, in the next couple of months with this treaty, he would have had a similar rebellion, if not a larger rebellion. You asked about our position. We're not a fan of this fiscal straitjacket. We are not entirely convinced that it's the right answer. And in that sense, and it comes to our notre ami français, I do think that, and to Petrus's point, that the politics of this are starting to change. And François Hollande has put down some very significant demands about the renegotiation of this treaty. Is this going to throw a spanner in the works? Probably it will do. Will it be for the best? Probably it will. Because you can't just focus on fiscal discipline. That is important, but there are also some balance of payment issues that Billy talked about in his opening that are incredibly important. And Spain didn't break the Stability and Growth Pact rules until as late as 2008. So it wasn't just about the 3% and 60% rules. There were some other things going on there which were deeply creating deep imbalances, which created the problem as well. On Chris's point, I couldn't agree more with the 2 points that you made, especially the second point, and I think we were guilty of this in government, which is when it's something good, you say it's due to our government. So, great, 4 weeks paid holiday. Apparently, I think during our time in government, the trade unionists and others, employment specialists around the room can tell me if I'm not correct on this, but I think at some point the Commission said to us, you can't have your bank holidays as part of the 4 weeks paid holiday. And then we legislated to make sure that it was 4 weeks paid holiday plus the bank holidays. But it wasn't due to the European Union. No, it was due to the British Labour government, right? And so that just kind of illustrates your point. And you're absolutely right about the language. I mean, I've participated in many debates in Parliament, more than you'd wish to know, mostly surrounded by other people arguing for other points, Eurosceptics, frankly, arguing making very different arguments to me. But it's all this about red lines and banging the table and threatening you're going to walk out. And it's the same with the Council of Europe discussion at the moment. David Cameron goes to Strasbourg and he says, if you don't reform, we're going to leave, essentially, was the not so subtle message of his speech. That's not how you negotiate. That's not how you stay within these organisations if you want to and get some of your own way.
Thank you very much, Emma. That's...
Thank you. Several points there, so I might get slightly confused. I will start with your point, Philip, because I thought it was so good. And as always, you're very articulate and very difficult to argue against. So I agree with you, actually. I thought perhaps my argument or my way of framing or making public opinion equivalent to democracy was perhaps a bit lazy. So I apologize for that. I agree, but at the same time, I mean, I think it's a fine balance. And yes, on a scale of things, how important is European policy in, when people are going to the elections? And have we come to the point yet when the EU actually plays a major role in general elections? Probably not. Probably not. It's very rare in anywhere in Europe that the EU is a major issue at the voting booths. I mean, that's a fact. So I agree. I mean, I take your point, and it's well made. And as ever, it's a matter of finding the balance. There were several points here. I don't know which ones to pick up on. On the point about misunderstanding how the Troika is making laws, I mean, I think it's the principle of having EU-level involvement in wage setting, and the Commission can be used as a vehicle through which the Eurogroup implements its policies. I mean, that is the principle we're discussing. So I mean, and whether that's right or wrong is something that I think everyone needs to think carefully about. And is that something that we want in Europe in future? I think that's a very valid argument. In terms of, which I think Philip and others touched on, this idea of different cultures and how, and also in parallel with that, how do you actually square the circle if you have free movement, a single market, but not a level playing field? Don't you need to have some sort of protection, some basic provisions there to go with the single market and free movements? And I think that's probably true. You need that. You need that. But then we have to separate between the ones that are actually practical and viable and the ones that aren't. If you look, for example, at the Posted Workers Directive, which was agreed, I think, in 1980s, I thought that was a very good compromise, because all it was saying, it was a free movement one. It was not based on social employment law. It was based on free movement, single market legislation, single market articles. What it was saying is that the minimum wage in the country in which the posted workers is located is what applies. I thought that was a very good compromise. That prevents social dumping. It didn't micromanage too much. That's all it said. What happened was that the ECJ kind of messed with it slightly. But I thought it was a very good compromise. Compare that to the Working Time Directive, which is an employment law. It's based on 153 in the treaties. So it's based on social employment law. A different article to that, which Posted Workers Directive is based on.
Health and safety.
153, which is health and safety, and employment and social. It's a catch-all article, so it's used both, for example, the Vibration at Work Directive and the Working Time Directive, 153. And which is a very interesting article, by the way, because Working Time Directive was obviously introduced as a health and safety measure first, and then to retroactively make up for that, they created 153, which was a catch-all article, including employment law. So I think if you compare the posted workers one with the Working Time Directive is micromanaging by nature. It literally micromanages the number of hours you're allowed to work every week. And I think whilst in principle it's okay to have some minimum level of protection for working hours, that level of micromanaging is very difficult to get right when you have such varied levels of so many different labour market models around Europe. And that's why not only in Britain but around Europe you've had problems with Working Time Directive in the public sectors, for example. So I think, by the fruit you shall know them. Look at what actually works and what isn't. Look at what creates sensible outcomes versus what is completely impractical and creates more problems than it solves. And I think that will take you a very long way to strike the right balance between protection and to have a vibrant European Union. Should I leave it at that? I mean, I think there were several things there. I mean, the point about that links also with flexibility to, there's so many notes here on my paper, so I think I will leave it at that.
Thanks, Matt. Anything we haven't picked up can be picked up.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I will say this on the Emma, on the laziness argument. It's more the anti-pro-European narrative, which I think, and which is prevalent across the political spectrum in the UK. It's not it's not a specific thing to social employment law. I think it's a general issue which goes across the political parties, and which I think we need to address.
Thank you, Matt. Billy.
Yeah, working time is all of interest to everybody in this room at this very moment. Everybody thinks, but I hear this argument about working time. I think it's really interesting that, isn't it funny how, if it comes to driving 40-foot trucks, We've got to have regulations about the amount of time you spend behind the wheel. I'm talking about the driver's hours regulation, which you have to have working time because you've got something of value, and yes, you're driving something that's potentially lethal if you fall asleep at the wheel. We introduced that in Royal Mail and BT. We improved the terms and conditions of drivers. There's a driver so that the loads are safe and the drivers are safe. So I don't buy this argument that the working time directive. I'll just European cooperation. Yes, we're trying to push through EU on Eurobonds. You know, let's have. You know, Merkel is setting a face against that, and we want to. There's got to be something around that. Fiscal policy. It's a minefield in terms of what's taking place. But one thing Emma said, which I think I picked up right, was in the 1950s it was about growth or development. In the 80s it was more about social policy. Well, I think there's a role for Europe in terms of the power of the trading bloc. Let's not forget that. It's a massive trading bloc. And as we know, with China on the horizon, literally and metaphorically, with great economic power, notwithstanding the current problems that are in Europe, comes with great power and influence. And, what I don't get about the anti-European argument. Well, Britain's going to wield its influence in the world against the BRIC and the China, the BRIC nations. So that's the next phase, if you like. But but if we're going to get there, it's got to be, not just a single market. It's also got to be, a common, dare I say it, safe European home. And on that, I'm introducing working time by cutting now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Malik. Right, well, thank you so much to my wonderful panel, and as I said, we can continue those discussions on in the drinks in a minute. That all leaves Owen and I just to say a few very final words of thank you. We haven't quite worked out how we're going to do this, but that's a good plan, and I'll fill in anything you miss.
Okay, I'd like to thank in particular our speakers, both those on the panel now and those earlier, our contributors to our pamphlet, you in the audience, whether participatory or not, in particular the staff at the Foreign Policy Centre and here at Trades Union Congress for the work that they've done behind the scenes. I think it's a good thing that we're beginning the debate. I'm happy to debate with anyone about our views on Europe. I think there is an issue around public opinion, but I think that one of the critical things that everybody would agree is we need to have informed public opinion. It's worth noting, by the way, all the polling we ever did in the 1980s showed that the British people already thought they had the rights in the Working Time Directive before it was introduced. So there is always a job of work to be done on these issues. To Mats, I'd say Swedish model, very happy, take it now. Instead of all this faffing around with European directives and stuff like that, I'll have what you've got, right? I think it's really good that the debate is starting. There are a series. It's really interesting to note that Europe sort of plunges down the agenda every so often. It has. I mean, if there's one positive thing I'd say about David Cameron's behaviour at 3 o'clock in the morning in Brussels in December, is that it has at least forced Europe much higher up onto the agenda for debate than it's been for a long time. And I think that's a good thing because it does mean we'll have a more informed discussion and debate. But the one thing I think I'd say from the trade union perspective is that, as several people have said, the sort of reduction in workers' terms and conditions and rights is damaging, not just for us, but it's damaging support for the European Union. And for anyone who thinks that the European Union does good things in whatever field, you can't do it without the support of working people, and at the moment that's being jeopardised. So I think we lose the support of workers for Europe at our peril. And I'm happy for Adam to add any final remarks, and then we can go and have a drink.
In addition to continuing the debate over the drinks, there are two other times when this debate can continue. On Friday, the 20th of April, from 6 o'clock to 7:30 in Birmingham, where Emma Reynolds will be joining us again, along with Laura Lee Burt, hopefully Margot James, and some other interesting speakers. And on on Friday, May the 11th. We'll be doing the same thing, but in Cardiff, with Derek Vaughan, Kay Swinburne, Dr. Nick Parsons, and some other exciting guests to be announced shortly. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming along today, and please do come and join us for a drink. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Well done. Good stuff.